Hello, my name is Jacob Monk. Welcome to this short history of the East-West conflict. Well, we are going backwards. We are starting nowadays and then we are going backwards to the time where this conflict started. And this is around 1700 years ago. Well, the first picture I have here, it is from the war going on at the moment in Ukraine. You know, in Ukraine, there are living a lot of Ukrainians and also a lot of Russians. And the Russians living in an eastern part of Ukraine. And after the coup in Kiev in 2014, the Russians, first of all in Crimea, but also in Donbass and Lugansk, in the eastern part of Ukraine, they wanted to be a separate part of Ukraine. Well, first of all, they wanted to reunite with Russia, not to be a part of Ukraine, wanting to be a part of the Western world. The Russians didn't want to be a part of the Western world. And since then, we have had a war in eastern Ukraine, a conflict that has cost a lot of people their lives. I would say this is a proxy war, and the only solution to this war is to make Donbass and Lugansk a part of Russia, not a part of Ukraine. I hope that will happen, but this is not a political video. This is a historical video. So let's go back and see an earlier point in history where the conflict of East and West played out. The next slide we see here is from 1962. It shows the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, this is quite a few years ago, but maybe if you're an old man like me, you remember the time where the Russians tried to send missiles to Cuba, and the Americans wanted to prevent that. That is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this was an example of the conflict between East and West, exactly like the slide I just showed you some moments ago from Ukraine. It is an example of the conflict between East and West. And let's go further back. Now we have 1933. That was the time where Nazism rise in Germany. And Nazism was first of all an anti-communist, anti-Russian ideology. That's why the primary target of the Hitler ideology was to go against Russia. That was why Hitler, he hoped that the Western powers would support him. Well, they didn't do so, but this was his goal. And a lot of politicians and private companies in the Western world, actually they supported Hitler because they hoped that Hitler and the Russians, the communist Russian, could go at war against each other, and they could maybe finish off each other so the Western world would get rid of Nazism and communism in the same time. So this was an earlier example of the conflict between East and West. And let's go further back. 1921. This was the so-called Civil War in Russia after the Russian Revolution in 1917. After this revolution, a lot of troops coming from the Western world, and troops being trained and financed by the Western world, they made a so-called civil war in Russia Well, as a matter of fact, this war was a war between the Red Army and the White Army. The Red Army was the Russian soldiers and the White Army was the intruders coming from the outside world. The Red Army was under leadership of Trotzky, you see here. And now we are going further back, 1853. This was the time of the Crimean War. The Crimean War was a war where Russia tried to reconquer Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire, it was an empire being still more weak, with still less military resources, and therefore the Russians tried to reconquer Constantinople. But they didn't succeed, because the Western powers, they supported the Ottoman Empire, and they defended Constantinople. And the Western powers was France, Great Britain, and northern part of what is called Italy today. Well, at that time, Italy was not an unified state, so it was some of the Catholic states in the northern part of the Italian peninsula. Well, this was a war between East and West. And the same many people said about the invasion in Russia in 1812 from Napoleon. The Bishop of Paris, the Catholic Archbishop, said that this was a war against the Byzantine heresy. Well, we have to remember that the Pope didn't support this invention, but a lot of Catholics, a lot of bishops around the world supported it. And I suppose a lot of leaders in the Western world supported this invasion too. But as you know, Napoleon didn't succeed. He burnt down Moscow, but he had to retreat, and 90% of his army was destroyed, the soldiers killed. But Napoleon himself, he succeeded in getting back to France, where he was defeated 2 years later. Let's go back to 1453. This was the fall of Constantinople. The reason why Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Empire, by the Muslims, was that the Byzantine soldiers didn't get the ally that they need. They tried to get the Pope to support them. They tried to get the Latin Church and the countries in the Latin Church area to support them. But it was too late, so only a few of the crusaders, only a few of the soldiers from the Latin world actually reached Constantinople and participated in the defense of Constantinople. And why was it not possible to have more soldiers from the Latin world defending Constantinople? Well, the reason was that Constantinople was under leadership of the Byzantine Church, and the Byzantine Church had way back told that they didn't consider the church in the West to be a real Christian church. So why should soldiers go and risk their life in a campaign to defend the Byzantines when the Byzantines didn't want to unite with the Christian church in the West? They didn't even consider this church to be a Christian church. That is why Constantinople fell, because the Byzantines alone, they didn't have the power they needed to defend it. And now we are coming to the Council of Florence, 1431. At that time, the church in East and West, they decided to reunite. The reason they decided to reunite was because the Byzantines, they knew that Constantinople would fall if it was not possible to have a reunification of the church in East and West. There was a reason for this unification, and the reason was that the Byzantines wanted to defend Constantinople against the Muslims. But actually the reunification at the Council of Florence, it only lasted for a few years. And then the Byzantines said, no, we don't want any reunification. And although the reunification was decided, the Byzantines didn't want to stay with their own word. They didn't want to accept the declarations that they had made together with the Papal Church at the Council of Florence. And now we are going further back, 1204. There, a Byzantine prince, he couldn't have the power in Constantinople during the internal power struggle. So he traveled to Venice, and there he bought a lot of Catholic soldiers and Catholic knights and told them, let's go to Constantinople. If we can conquer Constantinople, then I'll pay you a lot of money. These were professional soldiers, so they followed him. They went to Constantinople, and actually they conquered Constantinople. But unfortunately, this prince, he was killed during the campaign, so he couldn't pay the soldiers all the money he had promised. And therefore the soldiers, they sacked Constantinople. The Pope, he said, this is absolutely not a crusade. And he excommunicated every single one of the participants in this campaign. But the Orthodox, they said, well, this is a Latin crusade, so now you can see what is the result of the Latin crusades. We are going back to 1054, and that was the time where the church in East and West, they excommunicated each other. That means they said that we don't accept you as real Christians. And we're going further back until 863, where the leader of the church in Constantinople, he was called Poetan. He made a lot of lists about all the heresies of the church in the West. So he didn't even consider the church in the West to be a real Christian church. And therefore there was a very bad atmosphere between the church in the East and the West. And we are going further back now. Here we have the Frankish-Byzantine War in 801. And this war was about the power in the northern Italy. Well, Italy didn't exist at that time, as I've told you already, but the small empires in what is called Italy today, there was a power struggle between the Frankish church and the Byzantine church. And the Frankish church, under leadership of Karl the Great, also called Charlemagne, well, I believe Karl the Great, he won this war in 801. But the most interesting thing is that at that time it was possible to have an armed conflict between the church and the leaders, the military leaders of the East and the West. We are going back now to 787. This was the so-called Seventh Ecumenical Council. And this council was the last council that the Byzantines, the so-called Orthodox Church, participated in. Maybe you know there have been 21 ecumenical councils. The last council, it was from 1962 until 1965. This was called the 21st Ecumenical Councils of the Roman Catholic Church. But the Orthodox, they only wanted to participate in the first 7 councils. That means that after 787, the Orthodox didn't participate in the international church anymore. And the reason they left the church was primarily because they didn't believe that the Holy Ghost was going out from the Son also. They said the Holy Ghost is coming only from the Father, not from the Son. Well, a lot of places in the Bible you can read that the Holy Ghost is coming also from the Son. The Holy Ghost is coming from the Father, it's going through the Son. So the theological correct statement is the one used on every single ecumenical council except number 1 and 2. Every single ecumenical council since then has stated that the Holy Ghost is coming from the Father and from the Son. But the Orthodox Church, they don't believe that, and therefore they have left the International Christian Church. And now we are coming to the last slide I'll show you, and this is from 395. This was the time when the Roman Empire was divided between the empire in the east and the empire in the west. And that is exactly what you can see here. The empire in the east is blue, the empire in the west is yellow. What is white is the empire of the Huns. Later on, the empire of the Huns was mainly conquered or converted to the Byzantine Church, and this is mainly what today is called Russia. But you can see here the division of the Roman Empire. It is this division that laid the ground for the conflict between East and West. This all happened in the year 395. But of course, the root conflict, the theological and the cultural conflicts between East and West, they were rooted before 395. It was all about what language shall we talk, what calendar shall we use, what kind of a relationship between the church and the government do we want, and a lot of other questions. But the war today, 2017, the war in Syria, the war in Ukraine, it is rooted in a conflict that goes back to 395 and even further back. And that conflict we call the East-West conflict, and it is maybe the root conflict you have to understand international global politics today. Thank you for listening.